Every government makes the same promise. Your money is safe. The system is stable. The experts are in control. Every treasury official repeats it. Every central banker reassures it. And most people never question it, because questioning money feels like questioning gravity. It's just there. It works. Until one day it doesn't. We're told that modern money is backed by institutions, rules, safeguards, and centuries of economic wisdom. That nothing fundamental has changed, only the tools. Computers instead of printing presses. Spreadsheets instead of ledgers. Complexity instead of transparency. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The more complicated the system becomes, the easier it is to hide what's really happening. Because beneath the surface of what looks like responsible government borrowing lies a mechanism so circular, so carefully dressed up as normal policy, that most people never notice they're watching the same trick performed again and again. It's elegant. It's legal. And it quietly reshapes the value of your savings, your salary, and your future. When people imagine government debt, they picture discipline, limits, trade-offs. A country borrowing from investors who expect to be repaid with real money earned somewhere in the economy. That picture is comforting. It suggests consequences. It suggests restraint. But what if that picture is incomplete? What if the government doesn't just borrow money when it runs short, but creates the very money it borrows? What if the line between spending and earning has already been erased, replaced by a system that looks sustainable only as long as no one looks too closely? This isn't a conspiracy hidden in shadows. It's not a theory whispered on the fringes. It's an open process, buried under layers of procedure, terminology, and trust. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because this story isn't really about bonds or balance sheets. It's about belief. And what happens when an entire financial system depends on it? In theory, government borrowing is simple. When a government wants to spend more than it collects in taxes, it has to borrow the difference. To do that, it issues bonds, formal promises to repay money in the future with interest. Those bonds are sold to investors. Pension funds looking for safety. Banks parking excess cash. Foreign governments storing reserves. Ordinary savers seeking stability. The logic is straightforward. Investors lend real money that already exists. The government uses that money to fund its operations. And over time, it pays the debt back using taxes collected from the economy. This structure creates discipline. Borrow too much and investors demand higher interest. Lose trust and borrowing becomes expensive. Spend irresponsibly and markets push back. At least that's the story we're told. It's the same logic that governs households and businesses. If you want to spend more, you either earn more, or you convince someone else to lend you their savings. That constraint matters. It forces choices. It ties spending to reality. And for a long time, people assumed governments played by the same rules, just on a larger scale. That assumption is what makes the system feel legitimate. Because if borrowing is limited by available savings, then money retains meaning. Debt has consequences. And future promises are anchored to present resources. But there's a flaw in this picture. What happens when investors don't want to buy all the bonds being issued? What happens when interest rates would have to rise so high that the entire economy would stall? What happens when the demand for government debt simply isn't enough to support endless deficits? In a normal system, that's where spending would stop. In the modern system, that's where the illusion begins. Because the story doesn't end with investors. There's another buyer in the room, one that doesn't need savings, doesn't demand higher interest, and never runs out of money. And once you understand who that buyer is, the entire idea of borrowing starts to fall apart. When demand disappears, most sellers panic. Governments don't. Because when investors hesitate, a different buyer steps forward, quietly, automatically, and without limits. The central bank. Officially, it's independent. Technically, it operates at arm's length from politics. In practice, it exists to make sure the system never runs out of money. Here's how it works. Congress approves spending that exceeds tax revenue. The Treasury issues bonds to cover the gap, IOUs promising future repayment. Under normal conditions, those bonds would need real buyers with real savings. But when the market can't, or won't, absorb them all, the central bank intervenes. It doesn't borrow. It doesn't save. It doesn't transfer money from somewhere else. It creates new money. Not by printing bills, but by typing numbers into existence. Digital entries. Balance sheet adjustments. Currency that did not exist a moment earlier. That newly created money is then used to buy government bonds. Think about that sequence carefully. The government issues debt. The central bank creates money. The money buys the debt. And suddenly, spending power exists where none existed before. No factory produced it. No worker earned it. No saver postponed consumption for it. It simply appeared, precisely when it was needed. This is often described as liquidity support or open market operations. Neutral language, technical language, reassuring language, but strip away the vocabulary and the reality becomes clear. The government is funding itself with money created specifically to buy its own promises. Borrowing without a lender who ever says no. And once that door is open, it never really closes. Because the question is no longer can the government finance its spending, only whether anyone is paying close enough attention to notice how. At this point, the system stops looking like borrowing and starts looking like something else entirely. Because when one branch of the government issues debt and another branch creates money to buy it, there's no outside constraint. No independent saver. No real lender taking risk. It's a closed loop. The Treasury says we need money. The central bank responds, here it is. And the debt is quietly placed on a balance sheet that never has to demand repayment in the real-world sense. If any private institution tried this, it would be called fraud. Imagine a company issuing bonds, then creating its own currency to buy those bonds, and booking the proceeds as revenue. Imagine an individual writing themselves a check, depositing it and claiming they're richer. The logic would collapse instantly. But when governments do it, wrapped in policy language and technical process, it's presented as stability. And the brilliance of the system is that it looks legitimate. There are auctions. There are intermediaries. There are rules about timing and procedure. Everything feels market-driven. But the outcome is predetermined. If demand falters, the central bank fills the gap. If interest rates threaten to rise, intervention follows. If deficits grow too large, money creation grows with them. The constraint that exists for everyone else, earning before spending, simply doesn't apply. This is why deficits no longer spark panic. Why debt numbers lose meaning. Why spending programs are announced without clear funding sources. Because the system has learned it can always finance itself. Not by producing more, but by redefining what money is. And once money becomes a policy tool instead of a measure of value, the consequences stop being abstract. They start showing up everywhere else. This mechanism wasn't always used openly. For a long time, it was treated like a fire extinguisher. Something to break out only when the building was already burning. A financial crisis. A market collapse. A system on the brink. In those moments, creating money to stabilize government debt was framed as necessary. Temporary. A last resort. And at first, people believed that. After the 2008 financial crisis, central bank balance sheets exploded. Trillions of dollars were created to buy government bonds and distressed assets. The justification was simple. Without intervention, the system would fail. Then came the pandemic. Spending surged overnight. Entire economies were shut down by policy. Relief programs expanded at a speed no tax system could ever match. So the same solution was used again, only this time at an unprecedented scale. Money was created. Debt was absorbed. Deficits stopped being debated and started being normalized. And something important changed. What had once been described as an emergency response quietly became standard practice. Markets adjusted their expectations. Governments adjusted their behavior. And central banks adjusted their definitions of normal. Every slowdown now justifies intervention. Every crisis demands liquidity. Every problem is met with more money. Not because it's free, but because the cost is delayed. The bill doesn't arrive as a tax increase. It doesn't show up as a spending cut. It arrives slowly, invisibly in the value of money itself. And by the time people feel it, the cause is already buried under years of policy decisions. This is how extraordinary measures become permanent. Not through a single decision, but through repetition. And once the system adapts to unlimited financing, reversing it becomes almost impossible. Because the consequences don't stay contained within balance sheets. They leak into everyday life. When new money is created, it doesn't spread evenly across the economy. It never has. It enters through specific doors, financial institutions, large banks, major market players. From there, it flows outward step by step, losing power as it goes. This is the part most people are never shown. The first recipients of newly created money aren't workers or families. They're balance sheets, trading desks, asset markets. Stocks rise, not because companies suddenly became more productive, but because more money is chasing the same shares. Real estate prices surge, not because homes improved overnight, but because cheap credit floods the market. Assets inflate long before wages ever move. By the time new money reaches the broader public, prices have already adjusted. Rent is higher. Homes are further out of reach. Education costs more. Everyday expenses quietly climb. And wages? They lag behind. This is why the economy can look strong on paper while people feel poorer in real life. Why markets hit record highs while savings buy less each year. Why owning assets matters more than producing value. The system rewards proximity to money creation, not effort, not productivity, not contribution. Those who already own assets see their wealth multiply. Those who rely on income watch purchasing power erode. This isn't an accident. It's a structural outcome. Inflation in this context isn't just rising prices. It's a redistribution mechanism. From savers to spenders. From workers to asset holders. From the future to the present. And because it happens gradually, without a single moment of impact, it's rarely questioned. People blame corporations. They blame supply chains. They blame each other. Few look at the source. But the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to pretend the effects are temporary. Because once money loses its role as a stable measure of value, everything built on it starts to shift, including politics. In a system like this, something fundamental breaks. The connection between spending and accountability. In the past, government promises came with a price tag. If politicians wanted to spend more, they had to raise taxes. And when taxes went up, voters noticed. That feedback loop mattered. It forced trade-offs. It imposed limits. But when money can be created to cover the gap, that loop weakens, and eventually snaps. Spending no longer requires consent in the same way. Programs can be expanded without immediate cost. Deficits can grow without visible consequences. The price is still paid, but not directly. Instead of showing up on a tax bill, it's spread across everyone who holds the currency. Quietly, gradually, invisibly, inflation becomes a hidden tax. One that doesn't need approval. One that doesn't trigger debate. Politicians learn that they can promise more without asking more. Voters learn they can demand more without feeling the cost, at least not right away. And over time, both sides lose touch with reality. Money starts to feel unlimited. Resources start to feel abstract. Constraints start to feel optional. But real resources don't work that way. Factories still have limits. Labor still has limits. Energy, materials, time, none of these can be printed. When financial signals stop reflecting those limits, decisions get distorted. Bad investments survive. Inefficiency spreads. Short-term comfort replaces long-term stability. And the longer this continues, the more fragile the system becomes. Because trust, once lost, is almost impossible to restore. Which brings us to the final question. What happens when the rest of the world stops believing? For decades, this system worked not just because of policy, but because of belief. The dollar wasn't just a national currency. It became the backbone of global trade. The unit used to price energy. The reserve held by central banks around the world. As long as that remained true, America's ability to finance itself this way felt limitless. Foreign governments bought the debt. Global trade demanded dollars. Confidence reinforced itself. But confidence is not permanent. It depends on trust that the money will hold value. Trust that debt will be honored in meaningful terms. Trust that rules won't change when pressure rises. And slowly that trust is being questioned. Not with headlines, but with actions. Countries reducing their dollar reserves. New payment systems built outside traditional channels. Bilateral trade settled without dollars. Not because of ideology. Not because of hostility. But because any system that allows one country to create money to buy its own debt gives that country extraordinary power and extraordinary risk. Because the math doesn't reset. Every cycle adds more debt. Every solution requires more money. Every expansion dilutes the value of what already exists. And eventually the illusion reaches its limit. Not all at once. Not in a single collapse. But through erosion. Savings that buy less. Promises that stretch thinner. Stability that feels increasingly fragile. This is the real cost of the system, not numbers on a balance sheet, but the quiet transfer of value over time. From those who save to those who spend. From those who work to those who own. From the future to the present. And the most dangerous part? Most people never see it happening. Until they do. That's why understanding this system matters. Not to panic, but to see clearly. Because once you understand how the illusion works, you stop mistaking it for reality. If you want to keep uncovering how money, power, and incentives really shape the financial world, this is exactly what we do here. Subscribe to Finance Archives. Because history doesn't repeat itself blindly. It repeats where people stop paying attention.